There is a moment in the life of money that most people never experience, not because they cannot afford it, not because they lack intelligence or opportunity, but because they never stay still long enough to see it happen. Imagine a river, not a raging torrent, but a quiet stream moving through a valley. For miles, the water flows gently across flat land, barely making a sound. Nothing seems to change. The landscape remains the same. But then, almost imperceptibly, the ground begins to slope. The water moves a little faster. Small stones start to shift, and suddenly, without warning, the stream reaches an edge. What was once a quiet flow becomes a waterfall. The same water, the same river, but everything has changed. This is what happens at $10,000. It is not a finish line. It is not wealth. It is not security, but it is a threshold, a place where the rules of money begin to transform, where the physics of accumulation shift beneath your feet. Most people spend their entire lives on the flat ground, watching the water flow past them, never realizing that just beyond their vision, the landscape changes completely. But here is the strange part. Most people never realize the threshold exists at all. The invisible boundary. There are certain numbers in life that carry weight beyond their mathematics. 18 years old, the age of legal adulthood. Not because something magical happens to your brain on that birthday, but because society has drawn a line in the sand and declared that everything on the other side operates differently. $10,000 is one of those lines. But unlike the age of adulthood, nobody tells you when you cross it. There is no ceremony, no notification, no sudden revelation. The change is so subtle that most people walk right past it without ever knowing they have entered new territory. In the early stages of financial life, money behaves like sand. You gather it in your hands, but it slips through your fingers. You earn a paycheck. It arrives with promise. Then rent takes its share. Groceries claim their portion. The car needs gas. The phone bill arrives. Insurance, utilities, the subscription you forgot to cancel. By the end of the month, your hands are empty again, and you are back where you started. This is not a moral failing. This is not poor planning. This is simply the mathematics of survival. When every dollar you earn has already been assigned a destination before it even reaches you, accumulation becomes impossible. But something shifts when you reach $10,000. The money stops behaving like sand. It begins to behave like clay, moldable, persistent, capable of holding a shape. This is not because $10,000 represents wealth. It is because $10,000 represents something far more valuable: options. Think about what happens when an emergency strikes with $0 saved. The car breaks down. The repair costs $800. You have two choices, and both of them are bad. You can put it on a credit card and pay interest for months, or you can skip the repair and risk losing your job because you cannot get to work. This is what financial vulnerability looks like. Every problem becomes a crisis. Every unexpected expense becomes a catastrophe. Your entire existence operates on the edge of collapse. Now imagine the same scenario with $10,000 sitting in an account. The car breaks down. The repair costs $800. You are not happy about it. It is frustrating, inconvenient, but it is not a crisis. You pay for the repair. Your savings drop to $9,200. Life continues. The next month, you rebuild what you spent. This is what $10,000 buys you. Not luxury, not comfort, but the single most valuable commodity in modern existence: stability. And stability, it turns out, is the foundation upon which everything else is built. The psychology of zero. There's a concept in physics called potential energy. A boulder sitting at the top of a hill contains enormous power, not because it is moving, but because of where it is positioned. The height gives it potential, the capacity to do something. Money at zero operates in the exact opposite way. It does not contain potential. It contains anxiety. When you live at zero, your brain never rests. Every decision carries weight because every decision could tip you into disaster. Should you take the slightly better paying job that requires a longer commute? The extra gas costs might erase the salary increase. Should you buy the more expensive boots that will last 3 years instead of the cheap ones that will last 3 months? You cannot afford the expensive ones now, even though they are cheaper in the long run. Should you invest in learning a new skill that could increase your income? The courses cost money you do not have, and you cannot afford the time away from your current job. This is the tyranny of zero. It is not just financial, it is cognitive. When every decision is a potential catastrophe, your brain shifts into a permanent state of threat assessment. You are not thinking about growth, you are not thinking about opportunity, you are thinking about survival. And survival mode, while useful for avoiding immediate danger, is terrible for building anything that lasts. Psychologists have studied this phenomenon extensively. They call it scarcity mindset. When resources are scarce, the human brain becomes hyper-focused on the immediate problem. Tunnel vision sets in. You can see the threat directly in front of you with crystal clarity, but everything else fades into the background. This is why people living paycheck to paycheck often make decisions that seem irrational to outside observers. It is not that they lack intelligence. It is that their cognitive bandwidth is being consumed by the constant calculation of survival. But when you cross the $10,000 threshold, something remarkable happens. The anxiety does not disappear. Money problems do not vanish. But the constant threat assessment begins to quiet. Your brain has bandwidth again. You can think beyond next week, beyond next month. You can start to see patterns, opportunities, possibilities that were invisible when you were operating at zero. This is not a luxury. This is a prerequisite for everything that comes next. The first rule: money attracts money. There is an old saying that the first million is the hardest. Most people interpret this as a commentary on scale, that making 10 million is somehow 10 times easier than making 1 million. But this misses the deeper truth. The saying is not about multiplication. It is about transformation. The first million is the hardest because everything before the first million operates under different rules. When you have $0, making money requires trading your time. You work an hour, you earn a wage. This is linear, predictable, and fundamentally limited. There are only so many hours in a day, only so much energy in a body. The moment you stop working, the money stops arriving. This is not wealth. This is survival with extra steps. But when you have $10,000, something new becomes possible. The money can work, not metaphorically, literally. $10,000 invested at a modest 7% annual return generates $700 in a year. That is not enough to live on. It is not even enough to feel significant. But it is something you did not have to trade your time for. It is the first crack in the wall between your time and your income. This is the great secret that nobody tells you when you are starting from zero. Wealth is not about earning more money. Wealth is about creating a gap between your time and your income. The wider that gap becomes, the more freedom you have. And that gap cannot exist at zero. Consider two people. Both earn $50,000 a year. The first person spends $50,000 a year. The second person spends $40,000 a year and saves $10,000. On the surface, their lives look similar. Same job, same city, same type of apartment. But beneath the surface, they are living in completely different universes. The first person is trapped in a cycle. Work to earn to spend everything, repeat. There is no escape velocity, no accumulation, just an endless loop of exchange. The second person has created a crack in the cycle. That $10,000 sitting in an account is not just savings. It is a seed that will grow, slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, but it will grow. And as it grows, it creates more seeds, and those seeds create more seeds. Until one day, years from now, the tree that grew from that first seed is producing fruit on its own. This is compound interest. But compound interest is not really about interest rates or percentage returns. It is about crossing the threshold from linear to exponential, from trading time for money to allowing money to generate itself. And that crossing point begins at $10,000. The second rule: opportunities appear. When you have no money, opportunities are invisible, not because they do not exist, but because you cannot afford to see them. A friend mentions that their company is hiring, better pay, better benefits, better growth potential, but the job is across town. The commute would cost more in gas. You cannot afford the interview clothes. You cannot afford to take a day off work to go through the hiring process. The opportunity exists, but it might as well be on another planet. A stock market crashes. Prices drop 40%. Financial experts explain that this is a generational buying opportunity. Everyone who understands investing knows that crashes are when fortunes are made. But if you have $0 saved, a generational buying opportunity is just noise. You cannot take advantage of it. You can only watch while those who had capital position themselves for the recovery. This is one of the cruelest paradoxes of money. The best opportunities arrive during the worst times, when everyone else is panicking, when fear is highest, when resources are scarce. But these are precisely the moments when someone living at zero has the least capacity to act. The opportunity and the ability to seize it are inversely correlated. But at $10,000, the equation changes. Not completely, not dramatically, but enough to matter. That same job opportunity appears. You can afford the gas for the commute. You can buy the interview clothes. You can afford to take a day off without risking your current income. The opportunity is no longer invisible. It is real, actionable, within reach. That market crash happens. You cannot invest everything you have. That would be reckless. But you can invest $2,000, maybe $3,000. You can participate. You can position yourself for the recovery. Will $2,000 make you rich? No, but it will make you richer than you were. And more importantly, it will teach you how opportunities work, how to recognize them, how to evaluate them, how to act on them. This is the hidden education that happens after $10,000. You learn a different game, not the game of survival, not the game of paycheck to paycheck, but the game of capital allocation, of optionality, of strategic positioning. And once you learn this game, you start to see it everywhere. A friend starts a business and needs investors. You can contribute, not a fortune, but enough to have a stake, enough to learn, enough to be part of something that could grow. A piece of real estate becomes available below market value. You cannot buy it outright, but you can partner with someone who has more capital. You bring 10,000, they bring 40,000. You split the ownership. Neither of you could have done it alone, but together, the opportunity becomes real. These are the doors that open after the threshold, not because you have become wealthy, but because you have become capable of participating. And participation, it turns out, is the price of admission to everything that comes next. The third rule, risk becomes calculable. When you operate at zero, every risk is existential. There is no margin for error, no room for experimentation, no capacity for failure. This creates a paradox. The people who need to take risks the most, the people who need to change their circumstances, are the people who can least afford to take risks. So they do not. They stay safe. They stay stuck. And the gap between where they are and where they want to be never closes. But risk is not actually the problem. Uncalculated risk is the problem. When you have no buffer, every risk is a coin flip. Heads, things get better. Tails, you lose everything. That is not strategy. That is gambling. And gambling is a terrible way to build a life. $10,000 does not eliminate risk, but it transforms it from existential to calculable. You can afford to be wrong. Not infinitely wrong, not catastrophically wrong, but wrong enough to learn from. And learning from mistakes is how every successful person in history has figured out what works. Imagine you want to start a side business, maybe freelance consulting, maybe an online store, maybe a service you can provide on weekends. At $0, starting a business is terrifying. What if it fails? What if you spend money on inventory that does not sell? What if you pay for a website that nobody visits? What if you invest time that could have been spent earning guaranteed money at your day job? Every question is a reason not to try. So you do not try. At $10,000, the same questions exist, but they have different answers. What if it fails? Then you lose some money, maybe $1,000, maybe $2,000. It hurts, but it does not destroy you. Your 10,000 becomes 8,000. You rebuild, you try again, or you try something else. The failure is not fatal. It is educational. This is the great unlock that happens after the threshold. You can experiment, you can test ideas, you can make small bets on yourself. And small bets are how people discover what they are actually good at, not what they studied in school, not what their resume says, but what they can do in the real world that other people will pay for. Think about every successful entrepreneur you have ever heard of. They did not succeed with their first idea. They failed, sometimes multiple times. But they had enough capital to survive the failures, enough runway to keep trying, enough buffer to learn from their mistakes. The threshold gave them the space to experiment, and experimentation is how outliers are created. This applies to career risks too. You are working a job you hate, a stable job, a safe job. But you know there is something else out there, a different industry, a different role, a different path. But switching careers means starting over. Lower pay, less security, more uncertainty. At $0, this switch is impossible. The risk is too high, the consequences too severe. At $10,000, the risk becomes manageable. You can afford to take a lower-paying job for 6 months while you learn a new industry. You can afford to spend 3 months searching for the right opportunity instead of taking the first offer that arrives. You can afford to invest in certifications or training that will make you more competitive. The risk is still real, but it is no longer existential. It is strategic. And strategy is what separates people who grow from people who stay stuck. The fourth rule, time stretches. There is a concept in physics called time dilation. When an object moves at extreme speeds, time itself behaves differently. This sounds like science fiction, but it is measurable, proven, real. Money does something similar to time. Not literally, but psychologically. When you have no money, time compresses. Every day feels urgent. Every week feels critical. You are constantly behind, constantly catching up, constantly reacting to the next problem. But when you cross the threshold, time begins to stretch, not because you have more hours in the day, but because you have more control over how those hours are used. At $0, you cannot afford to wait. A bill is due. You need money now. So you take the first job that offers a paycheck, even if it is not the right job, even if it pays less than you are worth, even if it leads nowhere. You do not have the luxury of patience. You do not have the luxury of choice. The urgency of now overrides the logic of later. But at $10,000, you can afford to wait, not forever, not indefinitely, but long enough to be strategic. A job offer arrives. It pays slightly more than your current job, but you know it is not the right move long term. At $0, you take it anyway. At $10,000, you can say no. You can wait for a better offer. You can wait for the right offer. And waiting for the right thing is almost always more valuable than accepting the available thing. This applies to investments too. The stock market is high, everyone is buying, prices are inflated. Logic says to wait for a correction, but at $0 you have no position, no stake. So when the market goes up, you watch from the sidelines. When it finally corrects, you still have no money to invest. You miss both the ride up and the opportunity on the way down. At $10,000, you can be patient. You can wait for the correction. You can position yourself ahead of time. You can act when others are panicking. And acting when others panic is how asymmetric returns are generated. But the most important way time stretches is in your mind. When you live paycheck to paycheck, your entire mental framework operates in week-long cycles. You think about this week's groceries, this week's gas, this week's obligations. The future beyond this week is abstract, theoretical, impossible to plan for because the present is consuming all your energy. After $10,000, your mental framework begins to expand. You start thinking in months, then quarters, then years. You start asking different questions. Not, can I afford this now? But is this moving me toward where I want to be in 5 years? Not, what do I need to survive this month? But what do I need to build this decade? This shift in time horizon is not a luxury. It is the difference between reacting to life and designing it, between being pushed by circumstances and pulling yourself towards something better. And that shift begins the moment you cross the threshold. The fifth rule, identity transforms. The deepest change that happens at $10,000 is not financial, it is psychological. Something shifts in how you see yourself, not immediately, not consciously, but gradually, inevitably. You begin to see yourself as someone who has money instead of someone who needs money. This distinction sounds small, semantic, irrelevant, but it is everything. When you see yourself as someone who needs money, every financial decision is made from a place of lack. You are always trying to fill a hole, always trying to catch up, always comparing yourself to others who have more. Your identity is built around scarcity, around limitation, around the story of not enough. But when you cross the threshold, the story begins to change. You see a number in your account that is not zero, not just a few $100s that will disappear by the end of the month, but a real number, a substantial number, a number that represents something you built, something you accumulated, something you protected, and that number begins to change how you think about yourself. You start to see yourself as someone who saves, someone who plans, someone who makes decisions based on long-term thinking instead of immediate need. This is not arrogance. It is not superiority. It is simply a different identity. And identity is the most powerful force in human behavior. We do not act according to our goals. We act according to our identity. We do what people like us do. And when your identity shifts from someone who needs money to someone who has money, your behavior shifts automatically. Someone who needs money buys things to feel better, to fill the void, to prove to themselves and others that they are not broke. Someone who has money does not need to prove anything. They can walk past the sale, ignore the advertisement, say no to the impulse. Not because they are disciplined, but because buying things to feel better is not part of their identity anymore. Someone who needs money avoids thinking about finances. It is too painful, too stressful, too overwhelming. Someone who has money thinks about finances regularly, not obsessively, not anxiously, but strategically. They check their accounts, they track their spending, they plan their investments, not because they have to, but because that is what people like them do. This identity shift is subtle. You will not wake up one day and feel like a different person. But over time, you will notice that your decisions have changed, your priorities have changed, your relationship with money has changed. You are no longer running from scarcity. You are building toward something. And that shift, from running away to building toward, is the real threshold. $10,000 is not the destination. It is the doorway. On one side of the door, money is a problem to be solved. On the other side, money is a tool to be used. And once you step through that door, everything that comes after becomes possible. The return. There is a moment in every journey where you realize you have crossed into new territory, not because the landscape looks dramatically different, but because you look back and see how far you have come. The river that was once flowing across flat ground is now moving with purpose, gathering speed, carving its path through stone, the same water, the same river, but transformed by the terrain beneath it. $10,000 will not make you rich. It will not solve all your problems. It will not guarantee success, but it will change the rules you are playing by. It will transform anxiety into possibility, scarcity into strategy, limitation into optionality. And once you experience that transformation, you cannot unsee it. Most people spend their entire lives on the wrong side of the threshold, not because they lack the ability to cross it, but because they never realized it existed. They stay trapped in the cycle of earning and spending, working and consuming, never accumulating, never building, never crossing the invisible boundary where the physics of money begins to change. But now you know. You know the threshold is real. You know what changes when you cross it. You know that the first 10,000 is not about the money itself. It is about what the money unlocks, the psychology it shifts, the opportunities it reveals, the time it stretches, the identity it transforms. And knowing this changes everything. Because once you see the threshold, you cannot stop yourself from moving toward it. Not out of greed, not out of fear, but out of curiosity, out of the deep human desire to see what is possible on the other side. The water does not know it is about to become a waterfall. It simply flows, quietly, persistently, accumulating force, until one day, without announcement or ceremony, the ground drops away and everything changes. Your threshold is waiting, not somewhere far away, not in some distant future, but just ahead, close enough to reach, real enough to touch. All that remains is the decision to move toward it, to build it, to cross it, and to discover what becomes possible on the other side.